Good morning, everyone. My name is Kathy Hartman, and I serve as Director of Educator Solutions for Early Learning Indiana. Thank you for joining us on the exchange today. This space gathers community leaders across Indiana to learn from one another and experts in early childhood education. This is our second Ask the Expert event, where we bring national experts into our community to spark ideas about what we can do in our own communities and hear something actionable that can help you make progress in early learning. Right now, we in early child care and education are navigating a complex and often challenging environment. But even in the face of these headwinds, one thing remains constant: quality matters. It is the foundation that ensures meaningful learning for our youngest children. We are honored today to welcome Dr. Milagros Norris, Co-Director of Research at the National Institute for Early Education Research, or what we refer to often as NIEER. Dr. Norris is a nationally recognized expert in early childhood evaluation and evidence-based policy, with extensive experience studying early learning systems across the U.S. and internationally. Dr. Norris has spent significant time working with partners here in Indiana to strengthen early childhood education. A few years ago, NIEER helped identify a critical gap in program quality across the state. And much of the progress we've made since has been shaped by that foundational research. Most recently, Dr. Norris has collaborated with Early Learning Indiana on the Elevate Learning project, using data from environmental rating scales to help child care providers pinpoint classroom supports and materials that elevate learning experiences for young children. Today, she will share insights into Indiana's progress, the challenges we still face, and how communities can create conditions that make learning possible for all children. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Milagros Norris.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. In addition to that, it may be that some of your programs may have participated in the landscape study, and I think it's great that to have an opportunity to not just speak to policymakers, but also to the individuals and the groups and the programs that were part of the study as well. So we'll start with, I call this considerations of quality, because we're going to think a little bit of why it matters so much. And no matter how small or big we can be at different moments as policy priorities change, the center core of why we do it doesn't change. So we do it to really change and support children's development, and high quality programs do so long term and through their schooling years and so forth. So I wanted to give you a map from last year, this year, the map from previous year. This year it probably will look a little different in terms of the policies and access, but there is definitely a lot of variation across our states all over in terms of the type of benchmarks that we meet. And the benchmarks have to do with whether we have screenings, curriculum, the degree, the ratios, the class sizes that we have, and different aspects that support quality, including the use of data for improvement in some way, and to have measured observations and to have data that allows us to continuously work on it. That also makes the work, that variation, it also makes the work within the programs around quality so critical, because we can't depend on having all the supports depending on where we are in the map, right? So it is all the pieces that we are able to do within programs or in partnership with Early Learning Indiana or other organizations like it are critical to the experience of children. So one of the things that I was going to start is there's global estimates of the association between quality and child development outcomes. So we have tons of studies on quality that actually look with different measures, and then there's tons of study that use those measures and associate them with children's outcomes. And so we have evidence across the world, and not just the US, although there's a majority US research within this analysis and review of data studies that shows that higher quality programs are associated with higher social competence and behavioral skills. That's the first bubble on the right on the top. And then higher quality programs are also associated with lower issues around social emotional problems and behavioral problems in children. So that's that second bubble on the left. That's why it goes negative to the left of the zero. And then also that positive impact on language literacy and math, which is a lot of the conversation and a lot of the reason why we also care, because this is all these three combined are very predictive of children's development over the school years later on. So we call continuous quality improvement to the circle of going and really looking at data, analyzing quality, and then making something of it. That analysis kind of mapping the road towards improvement of programs. And it's important for it to be within programs, within states, within different type of interventions, if we're doing new things or we're trying new things. And so that continuous aspects is very related to the continuous quality that we do with children, in which we're looking to kind of reviewing where they are and then mapping what is next for children. It's kind of the same trajectory, but within the program, understanding there is a lot of variation. It's hard to get to quality, but it is possible. And so we wanted to show you a case study of New Jersey's preschool program. This was really very based on trying to do a high quality program in the poorest urban districts, starting at around a little before the year 2000, it was court mandated, and it had very low ratios of teacher quality to children. So it was like of teachers to quality requires a BA for all the teachers, and it's a class size of 15 with an assistant teacher with a CDA and a lead teacher with a BA. And then it's based on cost really of children, and then it was all set up to really be high quality across the board with a lot of supports. And a program like this also had all of these components around the same continuous quality improvement. It made sure that it was always collecting data, looking at data, trying to make decisions around data. And then really, and the support and the programs went through self-reflection times, the districts as well, to really think about what is missing and what should I do next to make sure that children have quality experience in every single classroom within my district or my program. So one of the things that was great about it is that it was using at the time, this is early 2000s, so it was using the ECRS-R, which is a measure of quality in a rating of 1 to 7, with 1 being inadequate and 7 excellent. And although at the beginning there were a lot in the 2s and 3s and some 4s, but very few classrooms in the 5s, which is the goal, is good quality of 5 and above. By the year 2008, the majority of them were in the 5, some in the excellent, and then some close to good in the 4 range. So this is the percentage of classrooms that we're getting moving towards the right. You can see the distribution in blue kind of being at the left, and the distribution in gray, which is the endpoint, being towards the right. And so that movement on quality was really about transforming and thinking using measures of quality through the process. And just looking inside the measure, you saw that there was, in terms of the percentage of classrooms that were hitting that 5 and above good quality, there was an increase around everything that had to do with books, around what had to do with communication, about language and reasoning, which is a hard one to move, but in that you can see that the move is much smaller, and then in the use of language in general. So really working within all the components of quality, just around here in terms of language and reasoning itself, literacy. Just a picture of some of the areas. There are much more areas that are covered, for example, with the ECRS. So that growth meant that a parallel study was looking at children's impact on children when the program was really at its good quality and peak. And so it was comparing children that didn't attend the program to children that attended the program at 3, and started at 3 and then attended 2 years, or started at 4 and went 1 year. So this is a mixed age program. 3 and 4s are served. 4th are a little bit of a higher percentage. And so really looking at the long-term thing. And what you're seeing here is every single bar, even though it varies sometimes in size, is that you have impacts on these children that are visible at kindergarten entry, but then they're visible in 3rd grade, 4th, ninth, 10th, all the way across the grades. And he really moves up. So he's maintained, sustained, and persistent for children. And they are gaining more and showing higher scores in all of these areas throughout their developmental and secondary school trajectory in high school. Same for math, all the way from kindergarten entry to fifth, sixth, seventh, and then to even at the levels of algebra in the high school degree. So this math strong infants and children's trajectory. And in science, the same. We measure science much less at the state levels, so much harder to see the trajectory, but the impacts were there even when we do measure them, and in the 2 grades that we measure them. So I wanted to start by then going back to where we were with the 2001, 2002 landscape, 2001 to 2023, and kind of do a reflection of where we were, so that while we had aspects that were strong in quality, hopefully we're able to sustain even in a reduced environment of where we may be serving less children. So keeping the eye on why it is, and then keeping the eye on what was children's development around that. So one nice thing about the landscape, is that it was the first landscape measuring program quality, a statewide sample of programs serving children birth to kindergarten. So it really went the whole spectrum. Many times we measure preschool age, sometimes we measure infant and toddlers. This really went the whole age span. And it provided an independent assessment also on children's learning. So it was not just looking at quality, but also at children's learning. So we had about 210 programs, about 320 classrooms, and about 700 children be part of this sample. And we asked, what is the quality that we were observing for children experiences? We asked key characteristics of early childhood programs, and then we asked the developmental status of children participating in the program, in the different types of childcares across all the state, and different variations around development. So I'm just give you a few snapshots just for the programs I wanted to show. There's a lot of a pretty good representation around types of programs, with center, local education ones, and home license ministry. So there was a good representation. We also had a good representation across the ratings of programs, rated 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, or non-rated. And then we also had a good representation around localities, mid-sized rural and urban programs that were located in different areas of the state. And so we won't go down to quality. In this study, we used the class. The class measures different, exists for preschool, for infants, for toddlers, and for preschool. And the 3 measures are a little bit different. They keep growing in terms of the size and scope of what they have. So while the first one, which is infants, really focuses a lot on the responsivity and awareness of children and the interactions, the children and the child language use, and the child language facilitation that happens. The second one kind of separates the parts that have to do with language scaffolding and extending children's learning, from that part that has to do with emotionally supporting children and children's motivation and responding to children. So it uses 2 scales. So we have to look at them a little bit differently. But one thing is we had 2 data points, but on average, we were in the infant toddler, which is the responsive caregiving, on average, quality was at a 4.8. And now we typically want to be at above a 5, which is the 5 is where the good quality indicator. In that sense, the ECRs and the class are very similar, with 5 being the goalpost for most of it. But there's a little bit of variations that I'm going to explain in a second why. So on average, we're at a 4.4 for infants, at a quality of 5.6, so above that 5 for toddler in the emotional support part. But in the part that has to do with scaffolding, learning, language, and extending children's learning, much lower at the 3.25. Now, this pattern is, I will show you in a second, is very typical, and that's because the parts that have to do with really extending learning children for learning in children, and in extending language and supporting and scaffolding their growth, it is the harder part, and it has to do with the content and the quality of those learning experiences, and much less with the support and the caring environment. So it's wonderful that they're in caring environments, but it is hard to create this quality area, right? So that was one of the pieces that came out. Just to give you an example, in the distribution for infants, about 61% of the classrooms were about 5. So we're not getting an average of 5, but because there's a tail here, and some programs were not showing good quality in for instance, but 2/3 were. in the and 17% when were under the inadequate level. So that was a little bit of what came out for the infants. For the toddlers, in a similar pattern, we have the emotional component of the toddler quality measure. We see 79% doing great, above a 5. And in the engaged support for learning, which has to do with all these concept developments and metacognition and scaffolding their learning and extending the language and so forth, 64% were above a 3. So here the threshold, we put it a little bit lower because we found programs have really difficulty getting to a higher quality in this. There are very few programs that get really to the 5. And on top of that, it seems like there's some relationship with children's outcomes once you start getting above the 3s at some point. So that's a way to kind of look at it. 2/3 were doing okay, and another third wasn't doing great in terms of that component. And compared to other programs, we can see that, again, in the infant toddler 1, the response in caregiving measure, we are, kind of at par with other programs, a little lower maybe than the Louisiana data that was looking at a 5.1. So we have other states. Not a lot of states measure quality this way in infant toddler or at large, and so we have not a lot to compare to. At the toddler level measures, we're doing great and at par the two other programs in terms of the emotional and behavioral support, but the programs in Indiana were doing, we're kind of at par, but the quality was a little lined up in the engaged support for learning. So that looking through the crossboard. So again, this is a lower for everyone, not just Indiana. And so always the focus on development quality in early childhood, making sure there's no low quality tails in the emotional part, but making sure the concept development is critical and the language development is critical. For the preschools, the measure has kind of 3 components. It looks at the emotional part again. Then it separates everything that has to do with the classroom organization, the management of time, the management of routines, the management of discipline, and so forth, and clear behaviors. And then the third part is very similar to that toddler one, where is the concept development, the higher order thinking, the expanding learning, and the use of language and stimulation and language expansion techniques and growth. So that we have 3 dimensions for the preschoolers. And so on average, it was, again, the emotional support did great, very caring, warming environments. Classroom organization a little lower, but it's sort of okay. So that's the 2 years at the average for that one. And then instructional support much lower than all the others, right? And so again, looking at the distribution in the emotional support, pretty great. 88% of the classrooms were above a 5. In classroom organization, little as great, but still positive, with 65% of the classrooms were a 5 and a few under a 3. And then in instructional support, we see how this is much different, where everybody's pretty low, the majority, at least half, and then there's only about 38% are really above that 3. So this is that kind of one core finding of the studies, these areas and the concept development and the language for children. Compared to other programs across and other high quality programs across the United States, with Indiana being this first bar, you can see that Indiana hangs out at kind of a par with everybody in emotional support, a little lower in classroom organization, with programs in Seattle Preschool Program, which is the gray one, or the light blue one, which is New York City, or the Head Start, or San Antonio Pre-K, which is the last blue one. And even Boston, which is the yellow one, kind of Boston is a little lower, but all these other ones were higher. And then in instructional support, which is the most predictive one and associated with children's long-term outcomes, it is lower than other programs. And the high quality programs here that we could have as comparison is the light gray, which is Seattle Preschool Program, and the Boston program, which a lot of people might know about because they really have had strong impacts on children. And their average is really above a 4. So it's a big difference relative to many other programs across the United States. And that's at the core of producing high quality for them, or one of the reasons why their outcomes on children were so positive. So 3 Key takeaways on program quality were for infants, really 54% of classrooms were rated at or above 5. So about half, this means that about half the sample is scoring below average. So that leaves it about the other half around. For toddlers, you have 85% scoring about a 5 in the first scale, but really about half again in the second scale. So a little less than half of the sample not receiving adequate supports for learning. And for preschool age, like we just looked, this is just 38% about a 5. So that means that about 2/3 are not experiencing sufficient instructional supports for learning. And many are not experiencing classrooms well organized. That's the second basis. So that was the first thing. Then we looked also at children, and interestingly, infant and toddlers really, yes, show lower initial development levels in language and cognition. So we assess them at the beginning of the year and then at the end of the year. And at the beginning of the year, we find they are relative to peers their age and typical development, they're doing a little less starting in terms of language and cognition. But they're at par with peers in everything that has to do with social emotional development. And their growth, though, is a little higher than typical. So they seem to be growing pretty well. This is quality that to build on, and their experiences to build on and not to lose. So it's important to think of this as we want to make sure that at a minimum we're doing as good as this, because they start lower than typical infants and toddlers their age, but not go back to lower levels as if we don't pay attention to quality, right? So these experiences continue to be enriching, and they continue to are able to catch up a little bit with peers their age. At the preschool level, the children also had lower levels of literacy, particularly in math skills compared to typical skiers. So this with all those are two areas in which they started lower than typical, and similar in vocabulary and executive function relative to peers their age. And during the study, so through the school year, the children made strong gains in vocabulary and showed expected growth in math and executive function relative to peers their age. However, their literacy skills showed slower growth than typical. And in fact, they lost relative to peers their age. So they're really lag behind they started lagging in literacy, and they lag behind. They started lagging in math, and they are able to maintain math, not lag more, but they continue to lag behind. That's kind of the story under that. So these are areas that therefore come up and become important. And so there's a continued lag in math, and the gap in literacy widens for them relative to children their age. So there were 5 things that came out of that as recommendations. For specific areas for improvement: enhancing infant teacher skills to support early language development and cognitive development, increase toddler teachers' acumen in facilitating instruction and modeling language, enhance pre-K teacher skills and strategies to facilitate instruction, scaffold learning, with an emphasis again on language development and on content and math here, because that was an area that was emerging from the data. Increase effective use of research-based curricula, because this study also had a lot of surveys, and we also looked across curricula, and then increase availability of developmentally appropriate materials. This was also a component that we added to kind of see, and we saw that there was some gaps in materials. So this is my understanding. There are 3 experiences in 3 things that come up, and then maybe our early learning Indiana partners can extend. So there are 3 pieces that come out to improve classroom practices out of that study. The Building Impact Study, which is about strong instructional leaders who optimize classroom practices through coaching and curiosity. Boosting early language and literacy in partnership with Green and Grow, and then the Elevate Learning Project to empower early learning programs to create stronger, more engaging classroom practice that ensure minimal growth for children under the age of 5. Under that project, we are going through working with all the Elevate Learning cohorts to use data to plan and implement quality initiatives. So early learning can talk a little bit about the initiatives in a little bit, but what we help them do is really use some of the data. And so for that, we said, if we're going to look at literacy and language, and we're going to look at math, we decided to land on the ERC scales, which have the ITERs, the ECHRs, and the FECHRs, all of which are for infant, preschool, or programs, and that allows and has specific indicators around language and specific indicators around content and math. And so that we can use that to see how the classrooms are and which of these indicators are lagging, and then provide them kind of some specific data and for improvement, to make decisions to what to strengthen next in quality. And so this is about this is focusing on the preschool age. We also have done exercises with the infant toddler groups and as well with the home providers. But just looking at the examples from helping children expand vocabulary, which is one of the main little items that are included within the scale in the ECRs, we can see whether there's an absence of those first three that we don't want to see in a classroom, which are not supportive of language development. That's the inadequate level, if any of those are present. Then we look at the 3 levels, which is the minimal levels of quality. Are they present or not? And then we look at the 5s. Are they good? Is all 4 of the 5 scales here, the dark blue bars, have to be present for high quality, for good quality, and then all of the dark blue ones have to be present for excellent quality. And you can see how even in 100 classrooms, you see the trend going down and down and down in the indicators. So that means that as the requirement for quality goes up, we have less qualities, and those 5s and those 7s are really just about half or less of them, a little close to half or less for some are getting that. So that kind of provides a way to look at data to really say, okay, let's hone in on how to do it. And some of the indicators on the ECRs are very are help because some differentiate things that have to do with resources, because they say what you have to have present, from things that have to do with accessibility and how you plan the days to make sure that you make time for these things to happen with children, and then aspects that have to do with staff. So and the role of the teacher in extending language and using specific words, in bringing in unfamiliar words in ways and describing them for children, and expanding vocabulary and adding to any conversation that we have, and having several turns in conversations and using a wide range of words, right? So it gives you a sense of how we're doing, but also how it is more and more, much like the distributions when we're looking at class, in which we have few getting all out there, the higher the requirement for quality that we should be present, we have less of the classroom. So this is a good perspective of where we are so far, although I think we're like a little bit more than halfway through the Elevate Learning classrooms, how they're all doing it together as a group. This is another one, the staff use of books with children. We have some classrooms where books are not read, which is a very, low-hanging apple to work with. And then as we talk about really reading with making accommodations, with engagement, with interest, with expanding questions, and engaging in different ways throughout the day, that gets lower again in the classrooms as we go down up the scale to the more difficult items that we would like present, which really those 7 items is what would excellent quality look like. And so they're kind of the goalposts, much like a GPS. There are 2 more that I pulled out for you to just think about this. This is becoming familiar with print. So it's the use of print all around the classroom and connecting. So there are 2 things: the language vocabulary. You're really growing that perceptive vocabulary. Even the children might not be using a lot of words. You're really extending the knowledge they have of the vocabulary and language at large. And that it's very predictive of how they'll do and associated how they'll do in their elementary years. In here, both the books and the print are anchoring that knowledge with how we use the language and how it's represented through all the symbols, and how it comes together into sentences, into phrases, into stories, into books, and so forth. And so that also is a component that as you go higher in the requirement and into the staff scaffolding and the different ways to use the familiarity with print and things print around the classroom, that we end up with about half the classrooms exhibiting those higher level quality indicators. And then for math materials and activities, And this happens in many systems. And we always have conversations about if math doesn't happen and either because of the materials are not there or the scaffolding of the teacher is not happening throughout, then it's not surprising that math growth is small or very little and for children in different classrooms. So it's important to think about the different ways in which this really defines the opportunities that children have to learn content and not just experience and do things. That doesn't mean that the experience has to be still maintained, still child-driven, still play-based, but it is about having the opportunities to engage with different type of content. And so here, even at the 5 level, we have about 60% of the classrooms that do not exhibit some of those 5 indicators in terms of materials, instead of engagement of staff and lead teachers and assistant teachers with the children, instead of encouraging kind of scaffolding the learning around math materials and activities. This is a way of thinking of that data and about the classrooms. And again, as I said, we're about 2/3. This is about 100 classrooms that we've looked with the ECHRs itself. There are about another 100 that we've looked with for the family home providers with the ECHRs, and there's about another 100 that we've analyzed with the infant toddler group, and which is the ITERs and that measure. And so we're walking the different cohorts, really trying to say this is different aspects. And some of these aspects, I mean, some of them are resource-based, but some of them are about really creating awareness and professional development within the programs to change and to introduce different types of things throughout the classroom. And the last one is math and daily events. Again, if you move to the 5, you see that this is not happening in about half the classroom. So thinking about all those high order things that have to happen to encourage the engagement with math and the non-math areas and the connection with the print and the numbers and the labels and so forth. And through this exercise, we talk a lot about how math is even more complex in many ways than language, because language, a word has one meaning or two in some cases, but at least if you say things like a cup, it's a cup. And we can talk about different types of cups, but it is a cup. And 5, or any number in math, represents many things: length, value, price, cost, height, quantity, volume, dimensions. And so because of all of that, it is a more abstract concept that we're trying to anchor through all the daily experiences. And so we talk a lot about working through that process and how all the materials around the environment and the engagement and the support and the scaffolding that happens with it are critical to create that basis for that. And not surprisingly, math is also, in the early years, is also very predictive of how the children do later on. So I think that's it for what I wanted to talk through with you. I'm happy to engage a little bit in a conversation. I know that's part of the plan. And let me stop sharing so I can see your faces.
Milagros, thank you so much. We'll give you a second to sort of catch your breath there. And I do want to just share with you that I have some questions that are prepared, but we also want to make sure that we open this up to all of you. And what's lovely about today's session is that we have a smaller group. So if you feel comfortable and you want to unmute and ask your question to Milagros, that's great. Or you can use the chat to post your question as well, if that's easier for you wherever you are in the space today. So just know that that's available. I'm going to pause and see if anyone wants to unmute first, if they want to start with a question.
I'll start with one.
Thanks, Jerry.
So I know that when we did our Elevate Learning program, we did the whole Fecker's assessment, and then certain things were submitted for this piece of the puzzle. When the providers did the technical assistance with you, did they get the same kind of presentation about which one of those things that were presented had the strongest impacts, and then were there packages that they selected based on that, so that then they could then build up their program closer to those goals? Or Or what's the next thing we can do to help support our providers, right? They're interested in improving their environments. We've given them a little bit of information. What's the next steps we can do from take them from where they are to what your research and all of the research shows is where they need to be?
I can answer the first part, and then Kathy, you can tackle the part that has to do with early. But yes, we did do that same exercise. We grabbed, and we didn't do it general like I did with 100 programs. We actually grabbed whatever cohort of programs. They had 10 programs, 10 spaces that represented in the things, and we look at their data like this in aggregate, so they can really see where the holes are, and we go through the items for language literacy. We also mapped the interaction ones because, content doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within the spaces and the small group and the high. So we did map those for them, although we did go in detail, but they do have the analysis so they can look at it. I also try to make sure that they are, or we attempt to make sure that they are able to think how this works so they can grab any other area in the Ficker scale that we didn't map and say, okay, I understand. Now let me look at the 7. So we modeled that exercise for them, saying, what does the 7 look like? What are the role of the staff, materials, and what type of things should be happening at the 7 level? And how do we get there, right? So that's the how do we get there. So we did do this exercise specifically with small groups at a time. And so I think we're at something like, I don't know, 20 sessions or something like that at this point, with all the groups in the home-based learning that have infant and toddler classrooms and there have preschool classrooms. Kathy, you want to take on what are the supports?
Yes. So once the data has been submitted and they've had this chance to learn about how to really analyze that data, the providers are then empowered to take a look at 3 specific areas for determining an instructional support. And those 3 areas are specific to whole child curriculum, literacy, or mathematics. So based on what your data is showing, you choose which column, right? Or which category best would help you make quality improvements. And then within that category, there are choices that based on suggestions that we've had from NIEER that we're offering out to all of you to help the providers improve the quality of practice of their teachers, to help them think about the teacher language, to help them think about the lessons they're designing, how to utilize the materials that are in the packages that they're also choosing from, but also how to enhance those environments and use those materials so that they're enhancing the learning for children, not just something beautiful sitting on the shelf. So definitely some instructional supports and the training that goes along with each of those to help teachers make sure they understand. Jerry, does that help? Okay, wonderful.
Good morning. My name is Pat Heine. I'm not part of the Elevate group, although I'm part of Jerry's track coalition group. But I have a long experience, I won't show you my picture, in working with all sorts of schools. What I've heard this morning is very important for general distribution for how to help providers and teachers who may not be a part of the Elevate program. So if we were hosting some coalition gatherings of, for example, preschool teachers who haven't been part of this study, how might you suggest we go about getting the whole idea of the teacher practices to the general population of providers? I've been in enough classrooms to know it's all about the teacher's vocabulary, demeanor, connection, and experiences that you provide for kids. So I don't want to take away from what you want to get to the Elevate people, but if you have any suggestions as to where to go to get some of that general information that we could be sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, and Oh, go ahead, Milagros.
Why don't you start, and I can complement based on.
Actually, I was going to add just a little bit. It was one of my questions too, of what suggestions do you have? Especially we have a lot of people represented here that are not specific to the classroom, but they're working in sort of those cross systems, community-based organizations. And so it does make me wonder about the suggestions that you might have that really you would point us to first and foremost to help people understand the importance and value of teacher preparation, educator preparation. How do we enhance that message to not just the teachers, but to the community at large?
I think it has, there's like different legs of how the conversation happens. And I can tell you, with all individuals in the systems, from the, state and the national, all the way to the coaches and the classroom teachers, we always talk about, learning from quality programs that have shown persistent and long-term impacts on children, and pieces that we do. So that's where, in some of the Elevate learning cohorts and those that are participating in that experience, we talk a lot about how, unconstrained domains are the most predictive. So is learning the letters, there are only so many, and there's a stop to that. And that's just one label that we will use throughout all the language and experience. What is unconstrained and predictive of children's experiences is vocabulary. So it is the larger components that never end, things that you in your life will never end up learning. And math is the same way. And that what we're building in the early years is kind of an anchor of ways to understand how it works, as well as expand the knowledge of how diverse and interesting the language is, and how diverse and interesting the math is. And sometimes we have to anchor down to, like, one of the things in many systems, I've evaluated systems in which reading doesn't happen in 50% of the classrooms. And so we talk about, it's not just that you're building the relationship that children are going to have with books, and that books it's pretty much the means through which we access every single aspect of information in our society and throughout our schooling. But it is, so that building that relationship, critical. In addition to that, the simplest book, like, even I give this example often, I have Mo Williams back here, I'm a frog. The simplest book has 100, this book has 100 words. And so that multiplied per day for more than one book, you can get anything from 20 to 40,000 if you're reading every day in your classroom. And that is also associated with children's experiences with language and vocabulary and literacy. And so sometimes it is that the way that day is organized, I have it in a certain way that by the time I'm sitting down for reading, I really don't have time. I rush through it. And maybe I skip it some days because we need to be outside on a line. And so I talk to systems and teachers about really thinking, what are the supports, and how is the day mapped in a way that supports that you are able to do the things that you're able to, that you have time for the 3-turn, 4-turn, open-ended conversations with children in which you're extending their language, building their vocabulary, and opening to different scaffolds of stuff, that you're asking questions that really are deep around predicting a book the same way. What is happening next in the book? Okay, what do you think? Okay, let me open this, show the cover of this other book. What do you think this other book is going to be about? Making hypotheses and seeing whether they're good, and then having discussions about why you thought one thing and then the other way. It predicts and builds all the concept knowledge. So I talk about quality at the system level and components and supports of quality within the programs. And they all matter, because even when you have great quality supports at the system level, there's a lot of variation in implementation, and coming stress into a classroom because you make too little, or because there's no support, so it doesn't help the children at all. So it's just thinking, it's the systems, but the programs, even within themselves, have a lot to do in implementation, because teachers are very different from each other. And one might be a great reader, but she never follows up and then the questions, while the other one is the opposite. One wants to control behavior by controlling children's bodies and saying, don't go to that area. And that already takes away in accessibility. So it is, so again, in this improving within the system also takes a lot of being open to learn within the system, across other teachers, across other programs, across other specific. What are you doing strong, and how can I learn how you do it? And you can be a model in that area. Well, this other program can be a model in this other area. So the peer learning communities, and I Elevate it brings that. Doesn't have to be within Elevate. They could be within different groups, within different ministry aligned. It could. But the peer learning communities provides an avenue of thinking different ways of doing things, and feeling also supported and not necessarily isolated, which is a problem with home providers as well. So the same way that it is with parents. So it's just like, I think is not thinking that quality is this big, horrible thing. What we try to break in the exercise that we do is, there are this specific things. Now, it doesn't mean that you check the box, you do that in this. Like, this is one area to improve today. And then once I'm able to make progress on that area, breaking down into smaller pieces, I can make progress on the rest, on the next one, on the next one, and the next one. So that's what the continuous component means. And so building that idea that this is a process and a verb, not really a noun. Quality is more a verb. It takes continuous work and continuous practice, much like parenting is, much like anything that we do, in which we're constantly engaging with children that have different things, different days. And so we kind of bring that. Now, having said that, is like, this is, I will make this materials are available. I put the website for that. If you want to bring some pieces, I'll give Kathy this presentation. And if it helps you in any way communicate to other groups, I'm happy to provide other pieces if you need other communication. And if you bring together a group and want me to have a discussion about them, I rarely say no to opportunities to help anything that has to do with quality, unless I'm really tied up. So I think we have many pieces and many people willing to engage to try to help communicate. Where the simple is, just think of the book and all the words that you're missing if you are not able to do that, to the higher component of how do we work across the system in quality.
Mm-hmm. Milagros, I think that word process is so important, right? It's not just a product, this final piece and then it's done, right? We are always going to have children. There will be classrooms. And so continuing to always think about our growth over time is important. And I even think about how we've approached the Elevate Learning Project. And even today, you shared data specifically around mathematics and language elements, right? Around vocabulary and books. And so really finding areas that you want to sort of hone in on, right? You didn't address all the indicators in the ITERS or the ECHRS document, but how do we sort of look with a focused intention and think about ways that we can implement new ideas, new concepts, new approaches with children and the teachers, so that growth and continued process and progress can happen. So thank you for what you shared there. Pat, hopefully you got some wonderful ideas offered from what Milagros shared.
Absolutely. And I think here in Wayne County, we are looking at an everyday child reading program, getting lots of community volunteers. And part of what I want to make sure they know is that there's a reason to do it, which I got today, but there are also ways to do it. And we have a local organization, Every Child Can Read, that provides books, and the Dolly Parton Imagination Library and all of those things. So we're trying to combine all of those for a big coalition message, is read to kids.
Yeah. I have to say, Pat, at the same time, we have another series of studies that looks nationally at learning activities at home, and reading is going down more and more, regardless of income. And that's because electronics are going up, and so they are taking a place of that. So even more so in that message is like that the less reading happens at home, the more important this book is, and this experience with this book is in the classroom. So it is a parallel trajectory that it is, it takes community, and it takes, and there's been this idea of the reading is happening. Actually, there's a couple now articles that have looked at other countries, and it seems to be a trend. And with how predictive that experience is of everything else, is one that I think is important to navigate in the programs, in the partnership with families as well, and in, like you said, in the specific contents messaging. So here we honed a little bit. I went from quality as interactions and processes to honing specific on math and language. And so those are some areas. I can tell you science rarely happens in preschool programs, and that's problematic too. But that might be the next wave for them. But it just does, it is specific, like you said, whether you talk about reading or bringing down to specific actions in specific areas, makes it much digestible than thinking of an intangible quality that has so many potential areas that we don't control. We might not be able to control what's happening in our state, but we do control if we read a book and what we do in the language. And so it is just bringing that down to those pieces.
Milagros, in the beginning of your presentation, you shared the research efforts from 2021. Do I have the correct year with connected to Indiana?
Yeah, 2021 to 2023, yeah.
Okay, so the new data that's that we've been collecting with the Elevate Learning Project, and from family childcare homes to multi-age classrooms, several, I think probably over 300 if I heard your numbers correctly. Is there any insights you could offer to us about, and I know that research that is hard, deep work. So, but is there anything you're seeing, any trends that are emerging around quality in these areas that from the original research from 21 to 23 that you're now seeing now with what's coming out?
Yeah, they're both different measures. I want to say, just like, when we go to the doctor and might get a blood test, we might get a scan, we might get this other stuff. So we might get more than 3 studies to understand how our health is. And that is true for measures too, in which all of them kind of point north, but they all might have a little different angle for it. I think what the class get, I want to think of the 21, 23 as at a minimum, and with current tendencies in terms of funding in some areas and stuff, that it should be a baseline to maintain. This could be like, you had strong quality on terms of emotional and caring environment. That should not change, regardless of how many classrooms you end up having across the road. And so, and then thinking, okay, that pointed to that, and the children's data pointed to issues around language, literacy, and math. And so this one, that's from the children's perspective and from the classroom general perspective, what's happening around building knowledge. And so this, what is nice is that they both align. The data that I'm seeing today say certain things are not happening in about half the classrooms. And so they need to happen, and they need to eventually happen in really high quality ways. But at least the absence of those practices, which is what is this new content, it gives you a roadmap to, let's start to have those practices and those experiences in the classroom. And then that way you look at it. So I think they're both aligned, because I actually saw in some of the interaction scales across the board, they do pretty well. There's some, the percentage of classrooms that may not be getting the high quality there is much lower. But when you look at the content components and the specific areas, they're really scaffold learning and help children anchor concept development, and then create, scaffold their language and expand it. And all of those are the pieces that you have like about half not necessarily getting theirs. And so they map nicely. To me, they're both part of kind of the same measurement, sort of what they're showing. And it's all the experiences of what happens next that might change that and move it towards higher levels of quality across the board. So that's hopefully what you come. I also think personally that the data that we have pre-changes in funding and things like that should kind of become this baseline to no matter what happens, if we do get in the future opportunities for growth that really are very supportive of early childhood again, we need to make sure that we start measuring to get back to what we had good and improve on what we had weak. And so I feel like that's kind of like a scorecard for us internally as systems to advocate to get there again if we lose ground in anything. And if we don't lose ground, in some states, they're not necessarily losing ground, and then it points to we should be gaining on all of those areas that we're weak to start with. And so it's good to have these landscapes because it really kind of puts a roadmap for us, and as well as guide some investments and make thinking, but it also holds, in essence, the states, environments, and communities accountable in that that's where we were this last 2 years ago, and we don't show improvement, or we have to measure again. We have to figure out where we're going again. And so it's good to have data, in essence, because then you are able to advocate for the needs that you have. And I think that's central, and not every state has landscapes like this that they can pinpoint to these areas. The QRS systems in some states do not use any observational measure. They don't look at children's development, and so that they're not necessarily the best anchor for moving forward and advocating for resources and supports and to strengthen children's outcomes.
I'm seeing. Oh,
that was a long response to your question. I was just going to say.
it's great. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Kathy. I don't know if this is a question more for you, the childcare industry or Milagro, but we have been running a screening program through early learning. We're an early intervention company, and we're just saying we all know that the brain develops primarily 0 to 3. And those milestones happen mostly between 0 and 18 months. Through screening, we're seeing about half of the kids that are showing delays, that by giving the teachers activities to do that are milestone based, more than half of those kids are catching up in those infant and toddler rooms, which is really cool. And I'm just wondering, how can we shift the childcare industry to understand those first 18 months or 2 years? It's those milestones that are the vehicle to get to the educational goals, because the childcare industry is built on education, which I understand, but we're missing that opportunity of brain development. And the teachers are doing such an exceptional job, and they feel so much more competent in working in those little baby 0 to 1 and 1 to 2-year-old classrooms as we teach those milestone developmental stages to them and what is really important in movement. So I don't know how we can blend those two better in Indiana, but I think we'd see a lot better outcomes at 2 and 3 and 4 in preschool.
We do. I would say, I personally, from all the research, would say that it all does point to integration of many things, and screening is a central component in a system at large, because it allows for early detection. Now, the building and all the development happens at the 0 to 5 age, because some of the things don't come and exhibit until you're 2 or 3. So, for example, language delays might not be very visible until a child is actually verbal and developing and showing that attempts of that. That was the case for my children, when you could tell that they had a backing and a fronting problem at the age of really 3, because that's when you could see that the sounds were not getting any clear. So it is just, those curves are important, but that's why we talk early. There are 2 other early areas. One is screening doesn't happen everywhere, and that's central. And the other one, it doesn't happen for isolated communities and in different things, and maybe around aspects. And we talk, so there's a trend that we see, that although there's a certain percentage of children that have some delays that need support at the age of 5, 4, if we are able to really embed screening into systems, we do find that there's under identification even by the age of 4 and 5. So that means that we're not screening everybody and not figuring out what they have. And that it is true, once they're getting to us at 2, 3, 4, 5, we're able to screen them. It might be harder to reverse some of those pieces depending on what the child is exhibiting, right? What the type of delay. And so it is focusing on timing matters to correct some of those trajectories, and integration of screening matters across systems to correct some of those things. That talks about the importance of individualized attention to things. So I do think that we somehow built this system to be completely separate instead of thinking all of the systems should be like this. And so the tapestry that we have in 0 to 5, where we have all these programs, it really depends on the states and it really depends on funding. It is something, and we have 3, we have childcare, we have Head Start, we have maybe the subsidy that doesn't necessarily intertwine, and maybe we have preschool programs that are this creates a whole tapestry that is hard to narrow. And then on top of that, we made early intervention be a parallel system that's supposed to connect with us rather than an integrated system within all the early childhood. So what we talk is like, this is what we have. It is parallel, it's different funding, it's different legislation that define it. And so what the effort is there, it has to be to connect it continuously through the whole age spectrum, and to understand who has access to any of it. And so there are many families that never ever get the opportunity to be screened until they're like in kindergarten. And so thinking of both working with the programs, but identifying sectors and places and maybe localities where we're not even identifying children because they don't go to an early childhood program, or because they are in a family care provider of different kind, or because so that connection is central. And I do agree with you, it is important to not think of it as different of it should be embedded as in the process of continuously. So it is an indicator. Do we screen for children? When do we screen? And many partnerships, I just end with this because I know we're out of time. It's like there are initiatives growing through the United States that try to do this with a partnership between the systems and the childcare programs and the pediatricians, in which there's some conversation happening there, in which is saying, invitation, and they get to learn about each other, and then they get to know what to refer, and if there's subsidies, they know where to send families to make sure that they have the experience that they have. And so the connection between this, the more the pediatricians know about early childhood programs, and the more early childhood programs know about potential ways to connect with pediatricians to get any additional or for any screening system, the better children are, the stronger the opportunities for children to better be served well.
Thank you.
As Milagros mentioned, it is now just past 11, and we appreciate all of you staying beyond that mark for a few minutes. But Milagros, the image that you just painted about this tapestry, that this piece that weaves us all together, that we need to start thinking and continue to keep thinking about our collaborations and how we are working towards similar goals for children and the teachers that serve them as we continue to move forward. So Indiana becomes this beautiful tapestry of the work together. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise and giving us some really important things to continue to think about beyond today.
Wonderful. Thank you for the invitation, and great to meet you all.
Yes. Thank you to all of you too. You take care, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.